Bon dia a tothom, benvingudes i benvinguts de nou a
Good
CIDO.
morning, everybody. Welcome again to CIDO for the third day of our first summer course about the challenges of the EU, which has been discussed. So far, we have discussed about the coronavirus situation and the EU's response to the pandemic yesterday, about the future of Europe and the multiple discussions that this will engender. And today, we'll talk about one of the elements for analysis that's most crucial to understand how the EU, in spite of the many difficulties that its working schemes imply when it comes to sharing challenges, is one of the international actors with the greatest capacity to make headway in key agendas for the European integration, but not only, also for the current international order. And today we shall do it with a special relevance because of something that is related to one of the legislation packages or the proposal for a legislation packages that's most ambitious that the EU has presented recently. I'm referring to yesterday's presentation of the development package for the European Green Compact. Very ambitious package whose goal is to reach climate neutrality by 2050 through the reduction of polluting emissions by 55% already by the year 2030. So we're truly here talking about a highly ambitious package of measures, a very ambitious legislative package with some challenges ahead, but at any rate, it is not the long term, but it will be undertaken by 2030. And we have it's going to be under the supervision and observation of many of us for immediately. This is one of the packages that has been adopted faster, bearing in mind the legislation, the EU's legislation proposals. And it has actually been discussed and developed faster compared to other legislation projects whose proposals are slower and require more time for their implementation. It is a commitment of the current EU Commission, which is above all based. I mean, if we had to use a title, it's to set a high price for emissions and to incentivize a number of measures for decarbonization. So between the high price for pollution and the incentives for decarbonization, that's where we find the core of the legislation package presented yesterday. And of course, he developed a rationale of the European Green Compact, which is very much present in the European discourse from the beginning of this Commission and even beforehand. However, given this necessary validation and acknowledgement of what these measures imply, it is also a package with potential difficulties ahead when it comes to its implementation. The package has generated a number of discussions and even divisions within the commissioners. And there have been some hesitations among some commissioners with regards to some of the elements of this package, and it also faces a legislation process after the European Union's presentation. That's going to be very complex. First of all, by the Council. You know that legislation processes at the EU after the proposal made by the Commission, which is what we have on top of the table right now, there is a co-decision process between the European Union's Council, the Member States, and the European Parliament. And in this co-decision process, they will adopt the measures that will be applicable. And this process, this legislation process, will be facing big challenges. On the Council's side, where decisions will have to be made by a qualified majority, but at any rate, they will require the positive decision of a large part of member states, there is a recurrent concern by those member states whose economies are more dependent on highly polluting industries to truly be able to achieve and to have the needed support to carry out the reports that their economy's transformation requires, an economy that's altogether very much based on highly polluting industries. On the other hand, there are countries who also have new debates that we have seen in other integration realms, the so-called frugals, who see with suspicious eyes, to use a British understatement, the establishment of the social fund and social aids and the resources that the social fund require for this ecological transition. So this is another element that adds up, in this case, the 50-55, the Green European Package. It says clearly the division between Eastern and Western European countries. There is a very much, this is a clear division during the refugee crisis, and then the North-South divide between those who ask for more incentives and therefore funds from the EU, which already happened during the Euro crisis. And the pandemic and the treatment of the pandemic and the proposal for the pandemic seemed to have channeled around the proposal with the recovery plan. But at any rate, this is a divide that's still present at the core of the Council. This with regards to the divisions between member states. On the Parliament side, we're seeing an articulation of a number of pressure groups, companies who see that through this piece of legislation, they will need to transform their production model, and they also want to have a voice in the decision-making process for this package. So, through the lobbies and the pressure groups at the Parliament, at the European Parliament, they are also articulating a number of positions facing the European Union's Commission's proposal. So we are at the beginning of a crucial process for the future of Europe, but we're also at a crucial turning point for the future of the world. We're talking about climate change, and we're talking about adapting to the challenges stemming from climate change. Yesterday the President of the Commission said if we do not adopt this measure today, tomorrow we will have warfare for the climate and for water. So it is better to start acting now before we have the real divisions that will crop up as a result of the climate emergency. And therefore, it is a package that's very much worthwhile to adopt and to work out. But afterwards, and with this, I will end my introduction to give the floor to our keynote speaker. We also have another issue related to social justice and how social justice is transformed or not, let's hope, into an issue of political instability. We do know that these measures may jeopardize, or they may end up reinforcing the multiple inequality mechanisms that exist at the EU. Of course, they will not pay the price. Those who have less resources should not end up paying the cost of ecological transition. They have more at stake facing their adaptation to a new production model. And also the already existing divisions between large cities or the city world and the rural world, and how the rural world cannot be the one paying necessarily for the price of that transition. But there should be territorial justice as well that should be clear in the adoption of the package. And let's also remember the effect that during the Gilets jaunes crisis had, the fact that the diesel price increase could be perceived as a reason to express a number of claims and concerns very much related to climate issues and ecological and energy transition issues. So let's not lose sight as well that this package happens right now. We're starting to negotiate it now, and we will start negotiating and adopting the legislation now. And this coincides in time, in the timing with French elections, the re-election of Macron, and the challenge that the Gilets jaunes implied before the next year's elections imply a very strong element for stability, not only for France, but for the whole of Europe. So in this package, and in this issue we're dealing about here about the European Green Compact, we have the two main divisions, the two main vertebrating elements for European integration. On the one hand, the needed advance in common goods, the adaptation to ecological challenges and energy transition challenges, and the European Union Commission to become a decisive actor, not only Europe, but also for the standards that are defined for other powers. Therefore, on the one hand, we have that ambition for change in Europe, and on the other hand, we have all of the economic, social, and political crisis elements that have occurred for a number of years within the EU. They are all combined in an almost perfect way around the discussions about the European Green Compact and the legislation proposal for Fit for 55. So there is no better way to start this discussion that we will be dealing with here today, which is quite complementary with all of the sessions that have been discussed in the two previous days, to discuss with Clara Della Torre, who is the Deputy Director General of Action for Climate at the European Commission, who has been behind the adoption of all of the package and the conception of all of the Fit for 55 package. And she has a global, holistic vision about the main ecological and energy transition element, and also how all of this is combined with a post-pandemic world, with a post-pandemic Europe, and with a Europe that also wants to be a global actor, a world actor. So we will proceed as in the two previous days. We will start with a keynote speech by Clara Della Torre, who is listening to us, I hope, from Brussels. And I know she has left, she has left her holidays to be with us here today. And I thank her for the effort, the enormous effort she has made to be part of this course and to discuss with us about all of these elements after yesterday. Even, it couldn't be more timely, as we say. So after this, I will ask her a number of questions to elaborate some of the elements she will share with us. And after the break, we will have a roundtable discussion, a panel discussion with experts who will be gathered around the discussion started by Clara Della Torre. So on my side, thank you very much indeed, Clara. Thank you to all of you who are following us from home, and to those of you who are following us in person here. You have the floor, Clara. Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul, for this warm introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Those of you who are in person in the room, and those of you who are listening to me from the cyberspace. So thank you very much to CEDAW and to the European Commission in Madrid, my colleagues in Madrid, for inviting me to this session. As you have said, Paul, this is a very timely discussion, because yesterday was a very important day for the EU. We will refer to yesterday, but a week ago we had another very important day, which was the adoption of the law for climate. For the very first time, the legal obligation to reach climate neutrality by 2050, going through a reduction of emissions of 55% by 2050. The Commission and the Parliament, as you have described very well, are the ones who agreed on this law. So, what happened yesterday is a very significant step forward. But between inverted commas, it is only the reflection of this agreement that's described in the law. I'm saying this because of the voices that are legitimate voices, but voices that sometimes are questioning a number of principles. We have to remember that we have a climate law that has already been adopted, and therefore we need to adapt all of the currently existing legislation in order to respect the law. But okay, let's take a step backward. The European Green Compact, which is the EU's growth strategy in a specific direction, the direction that will take us to climate neutrality by 2050. And it is a growth strategy. Therefore, it's not just climate policy. The climate policy is a significant part of it that I shall discuss later, but it's also energy policy, industrial policy, investments, economic policy, research. The European Green Compact is the roadmap to transform the economy and the European economy to respect the Paris Agreement, to comply with the Paris Agreement. Climate neutrality is a significant part of it, as we all know. And I'd like to remind everybody that climate policy shows an enormous advantage compared to others. It has a very solid and robust scientific basis. As we know, the scientific community, the scientists have been warning us about this for a long time, about the terrible results that we're seeing, the floods in Germany, in Belgium. And of course, this is just the start. This is just a terrible example of what's to come. And scientists had already warned us about it. So the scientific basis and evidence is very important, but also science and technology, with whom I've worked for such a long time and they are very close to my heart. Technology and science gives us a solution, not to all of the challenges that climate policy implies, or the Green Compact in general, but it gives us a solution to a lot of those challenges. Another strength that we should highlight in our policy. Now, another important point I'd like to remind everybody. As a framework for all of these political decisions that are being adopted, the struggle against climate change is not a road towards poverty. It's not a road towards something negative. No, it's a road towards growth, and it's a pathway towards welfare. Let's never forget, let us not forget that the EU, since 1990 until now, according to the data we have, has reduced its emissions by 25%, which is not enough, of course, but it has reduced its emissions by 25%. And yet, or at least thanks to that, we have grown by 60%. So, I mean, we should not oppose growth and welfare to the fight against climate change. And this is very important for us at the EU, but it's also important when we address ourselves to other parts of the world. And I shall come back to this point later on. The struggle against climate change is a great opportunity for industry, for business in general. It opens up real gates to new business models, to new products. Or oftentimes it is said that there will be many products that will come to the market that nowadays we can't even imagine. And additionally, it opens up markets. The EU, our president and our executive president have said that they want Europe to keep on being a leader in the fight against climate change. And this leadership can be played by exporting green technologies, amongst other actions. Our struggle against climate change and all of the measures of the Green Compact have also another added advantage, which is the generation of jobs, job generation. There will be new jobs generated. I mean, it is not an impressive number, the number of jobs that will be created, but net jobs creation, but many low-quality jobs will be transformed. Jobs with a low added value will be turned into stable jobs, and they will allow us, amongst other things, to exploit all of the potential, of scientists, engineers that we're training at the EU, in all EU member states, Spain included, of course. Now, this will allow us to compete in the world. Of course, not in terms of salaries. We will not compete in terms of salary. We will compete in terms of value added and technology. Now, the Green Compact also turned the EU, or at least it tries for the EU to be an attractive place to produce, an attractive place to live, of course, an attractive place to research, an attractive place to invest. As I was saying, the European Green Compact affects many aspects of our lives and of our economy: climate, energy, mobility. We saw it yesterday in the Green Package. Okay, let me talk specifically about yesterday's package Fit for 55. In other words, to be ready for 55%. Let's remember, our goal for 2050, we have to go through 2030. And by 2030, we will have to have reduced by 55% our emissions. There were a number of proposals yesterday at the Commission, some of which were a revisitation, a review of already existing pieces of legislation to adapt them to the new climate goal. And there was a new proposal, like the one of the social fund for the climate, which tries to give consistency to this complex system. And it needs to be complex by nature, because our economy is indeed a very complex system. And there are different tools that we need to use in order to reduce emissions. Investments, as we have mentioned, we have citizens, and maybe we could discuss about this agreement for climate in which citizens are highly involved, and the Commission, and legislation. So what does the package do? As Paul has said, it makes pollution or polluting to be more expensive and not to pollute very attractive. There have been reforms of the emissions market, the so-called ETS, which is a system that has shown to be efficient in emissions reduction, and it's quite robust during crisis time, during the last pandemic or the current pandemic. The system has resisted very well. The price of CO2 emission is going up, but there have been great changes. We have reformed this system to make it more efficient, and in addition to it all, it has been applied to three important fronts. First, the sea sector, the maritime sector, which was not regulated. Fisheries were not regulated. And for the first time, we have also expanded the emissions market to the maritime industry. And the same has been adopted for surface transport and buildings. For land transport and for buildings. Why? Because these are two sectors in which energy consumption is indeed very high, very high. And in the case of land transport, what it does is increasing its emissions. Most of the other industries have reduced their emissions, but land transport has been increasing its emissions. And our provisions are that they will keep on increasing those emissions. So the fact that we have created an emissions market reinforces the signal that has been given with regards to CO2 emissions standard. And I will come back to that in a second. Why is this also important for buildings? Well, because buildings, the buildings in which we live, in which we work, I mean, it is important for welfare. We need to reduce our energy bill. And in addition to that, we have the wonderful case is that the building construction industry is highly intensive from a work point of view. So the Commission has proposed a wave of renewals in this industry to reach both things. Because let's not forget that 75% of buildings at the EU are inefficient from an energy point of view. So the great opportunity to reduce emissions is large, and the opportunity for job creation is also very large. Now, in the package, we also have a review of CO2 emission standards. There will be a number of limitations defined that had not been reviewed for a long time. Calculations say that if we do not make this, if we are not more demanding, we will not reach our goal. And therefore, we have increased the requirements. For new cars, for example, newly built cars, by 2030, they should have reduced their emissions by 50% and by 2050 by 100%. So by 2050, there will be no lorries or cars left that are not zero emission vehicles. Of course, if we want, if we do not want to make vehicles fully electric, either with hydrogen, electricity, because hydrogen is considered to be a neutral type of technology. If we want to have a car, we need to charge it with hydrogen or electricity. And that's why in yesterday's presentation, there was a regulation proposal to reinforce, increase, to have a good network of charge stations. It has been proposed that there should be charging stations every 50 kilometers. And for hydrogen, every 100 kilometers. Yesterday, in the package, there was a part devoted to the emissions, to land emissions and agricultural emissions. We know that nature is a source, is actually a sink, a carbon sink. And in addition to being an asset that we need to preserve in our planet, is also a very significant CO2 sink. And we need to update our demanding rules with regard to the preservation of forests for them to play the role of CO2 sinks. Now, in the international arena, yesterday there was also a significant part devoted to it. The Union wants to be a leader with regard to the fight against climate change and what this implies. What we can't allow is that there are the so-called CO2 filters. I mean, the fact that we're being ambitious, what we can't do is that these emissions that we have actually stopped in the EU actually becomes, this is what we call carbon leaks, that they go elsewhere. In yesterday's package, there was a proposal called the boundary or the border adjustment mechanism, whose goal is to say that, okay, in certain industries like steel, aluminum, when we import these materials, either you have to show me that you have already paid for the carbon price, for the CO2 you have emitted, or else, I mean, it's a much more complex mechanism. But in order to simplify it, either you have already paid for the emissions you have produced, or if not, when you import these materials to the EU, you will have to pay. So that should be reflected in the price. This is not a protectionist measure. It is a measure whose main goal is to avoid climate change. In other words, to avoid other countries from emitting CO2. So we need to push forward so that our trading partners have the same vision and action that we have at the EU. And the international dimension is also important. This maybe, we can come to this during the discussion. But yesterday, some of the proposals went in that direction. And finally, we could discuss about all of these topics during the discussion, but I'd like to remind you that, like any other EU policy, I mean, it is based on solidarity. Solidarity, which is one of the EU's fundamental values. And not only we have the Social Fund for Climate, which wants to compensate for the necessary reforms, especially with regards to buildings and to help people not to fall into energy poverty. But we also have other mechanisms like modernization, which is addressed to those countries who are overly dependent on CO2. I mean, their economy is highly polluting, and these will be compensated with regional funds. So we will not leave anybody behind. This is what they have said literally. And there will be money for investments in this front. Okay, there is a demand that maybe I shall repeat again. I would like all of you, once this session is over, I'd like to go to Google. For those of you who do not know about it, I'm sure many of you already know it. And you should actually look for the Compact for Climate, the Agreement for Climate. You will see how we all as citizens can contribute to this struggle against climate change, either by learning, either by reducing, or by being champions for climate or ambassadors for climate. I mean, this term may sound fearful, but we can all be champions for climate. You do not need to be a politician for that. Or by committing yourself publicly to carry out a number of actions. I mean, either by giving support to a company that has declared it's going to reduce by 100% its CO2 emissions, or by a city council that has decided to turn all of its public transport into 100% clean transport, or citizens who have decided to go by bike, to ride a bike. There is no small action for this. I'm going to stop this, and I will be, of course, delighted to have a discussion about all of the topics that interest you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Clara, for this presentation. You have mentioned a number of concepts and a number of elements to bear in mind when we discuss this very ambitious package. The trading system for emissions that has been presented, carbon leaks, as a global element for this discussion that we're having right now within the European Union framework, but it affects a global phenomenon like climate change. The rationale of solidarity, not to leave anybody behind in this transition, innovation, which is also coupled with one of the main elements that actually compose this commission and its political priorities, i.e. digital transition. And of course, last but not least, the framework in which we structured yesterday's package to struggle against climate change and all of the regulatory framework that has been started for a long time. Now, I'd like to talk to you about some additional elements so that you elaborate some of the topics you have already mentioned. Before we start with the Q&A session, questions from our online and in-person audience. I'm sure they will all have many questions to ask you. So the first question would be, the triangle that is established between the situation, the European situation and the European recovery after the pandemic, in which some voices have been raised that mention that this is the very first global health crisis related to issues related to climate and issues related to our interaction with nature at the end of the day. And therefore, this package and this transition are built up at a time in which we are reconstructing ourselves after the pandemic. Another vortex of the triangle, which is related to the Green Compact in itself, and the proposals to make headway in this sense. And the third axis is the combination element for all of these political goals with the other legs for recovery, especially the digital recovery. Here we are building up a wholly comprehensive triangle that affects many of the post-pandemic recovery elements. But I'd like you to tell us, could you elaborate a bit more on what the narrative, what the storytelling behind the current proposals, not only within the framework of 2030, 2050, in terms of emissions reduction and the contribution to mitigate the effect of climate change, but also with regard to the rationale related to future coming crises. How is Europe getting ready for potential future pandemics or other effects of climate change? So on the one hand, I'd like you to adopt a long-term vision and tell us, how does this package fit in the triangle I have just mentioned? Well, thank you, Paul. This is a triangle. It's a very interesting triangle, as you have well described. The Green Deal, has a calendar. When the Commission proposed it, it was 2019. And the pandemic started in February or March. In February or March 2020. And some people said, well, now that we have here, we can't take care of this. I mean, with the pandemic, the Green Deal is not a priority anymore. Some people said that, but the Green Deal was made due to that. So let's turn this into a challenge, into an opportunity. We have a unique opportunity in this generation, i.e. that all of the money, all of this public and private money that's on top of the table for the European reconstruction after this crisis, and above all, this health crisis, to reconstruct Europe long-term. So we have to be very, very careful indeed to see how we are investing this money. We have all seen the discussions that you have mentioned in your introduction about the global challenges. A large package was achieved quickly for the reconstruction. For the very first time, the EU has actually indebted itself, and we have actually got indebted. And all of these resources have to be invested with a long-term future vision. Now, in this reconstruction package, 37% of investment, at least, need to have the spirit, so to speak, of the Green Deal. There is another dimension I haven't mentioned in my introduction, which is about how we look up to the future, our adaptation to climate change. In the package, we always talk about the mitigation of climate change. But unfortunately, as we all know, Climate change has already destroyed many things. And even if we stop emitting now, climate change will keep on destroying many things. So we have also proposed an adaptation to climate change. And that is coupled with a number of investments that are part of this triangle you have mentioned. So it is a harmonious triangle in the sense that at the same time we have to rebuild, to reconstruct our future. And we have some extraordinary resources that have come to our hands for this reason. You have mentioned, and you're right to mention it, Paul, the fact that in this triangle, we have a transformation for the Green Deal. The green transformation cannot be carried out if there isn't a green digitalization with smarter jobs, smarter production, and the green digitization is absolutely a must. Sorry, have I interrupted you? No, I didn't want to interrupt you. Have I interrupted you? No, I was finishing. So the time has come in which this triangle needs to be done all together. And with these recovery plans we have seen that have been approved by the Commission have approved these green plans, and the fund will come very soon so that it all turns into a beneficial triangle for everybody. Excellent. Thank you, Clara. There is another point. I'd like to ask you two additional questions. One internal question and one external question. The internal one, also bearing in mind those who are following us from their homes and the in-person audience that you can't see but that I see. They are basically young people in these summer calls, in these first summer calls, that I'm convinced that in these young people's minds, they have an existential crisis for their lives. What it means, what all of the things we're discussing here today mean for their lives. You have talked about climate ambassadors, climate champions, and the citizens' involvement and engagement in all of this transition process. But could you be a bit more specific? Could you get down into the detail, in the binomial? We're not talking about a triangle now, but a binomial between all of these measures and the Green Deal with citizens' participation and citizen engagement in all of this process. Beyond the proposals we have on top of the table, which count on this citizens' engagement, this young citizens' engagement in the discussion, especially with regards to all of the things that will be started up in the next few months and years, what are the mechanisms that exist in order to make sure that this link between citizens and decision-making process, to just summarize it, how do they exist and how should we promote them? Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul. The executive deputy president, Mr. Zimmerman, has said oftentimes in public that without the youth mobilization for climate, the Green Deal would have not been adopted so quickly at the beginning of this commission. So we are very thankful. We need to acknowledge and recognize the importance of citizens' movements, and especially the mobilization of our youth. Let's not forget that the transformation that we've been discussing for a long time cannot be carried out only with money and legislation. If citizens are not fully convinced and do not participate in it, we will not achieve our goals, because many of these things take us to behavioral changes and lifestyle changes. And with that, I do not mean that we can only go on holiday on bike and 3 kilometers away from home. No, I mean that we need to think about the way we use resources and to do things in a good way. And this, without citizens' engagement, is impossible. That's why the Green Deal is a place in which we can get inspiration, or we can inspire others, or we can be inspired on the climate, on the climate deal, or the Green Deal. And here we can see what we can do, what things are being done by others that we could add to our proposal, what proposals we could make. It is the place, the Green Deal is one of the places in which citizens can actually meet, it's the meeting point. And in which it's the meeting point for businesses, it's the meeting point for mayors, for regional governments, in order to carry out actions beyond what the law forces us to do. There is another place, well, I'm talking in Africa, there's another way through which citizens, there is another entry gate for citizens to participate in the design of this climate policy and beyond the EU, which is the so-called Conference for the Future of Europe. As you know, it was opened last. It is an initiative approved by the Council and the Parliament in which we're asking citizens, what do they want? How do they see the future of Europe? How would they like the future of Europe be? How could they contribute to the future of Europe? And one of the main topics is the natural environment and health. There will be citizens panels, there will be citizens assemblies, and many different ways of participating. You can search in Google the Conference for the Future of Europe. And out of all of these discussions, there will be a number of recommendations made. And in principle, these recommendations will be published in March next year. Another place in which co-creation with citizens is very important is innovation. Within the European framework, Horizon Europe, there are 5 calls, the so-called 5 missions. And the missions are initiative actions that stem from science and technology, wider initiatives that want to solve a number of citizens' challenges, one of which, there are 5 of them, 4 of which are related to the Green Deal. One of them is about the climate change, and I have the great honor of being the chairwoman of that mission. And here we're just about to launching, everything is ready for it, we are about to launching specific mechanisms, citizens, for regions, and for municipalities to participate in the design of this transformation that we need in a number of areas. When we talk about mobility, or when we talk about climate change, or when we talk about the oceans, or when we talk about cities. As you can see, there are different ways through which citizens can participate. And let me tell you one thing. When we received contributions from citizens, either spontaneous or because we ask for them, I can assure you we read them deeply, we discuss them, we think about them, and we include them in our papers. Of course, we receive contradictory things. We cannot meet everybody's expectations or satisfy everybody. That would be impossible. But I can assure you that the European Commission, when it actually decides to make a public consultation, we take it very seriously. Thank you, Clara. Thank you very much indeed. I told you that I would ask you a second question, but I'm told that there are many, many questions from the participants, so I'm not going to ask it now. I will keep it just in case somebody else wanted to ask about it, interaction with other international powers, and the EU's capacity to act as a regulatory power. And through that internal regulatory power, it sets a role model to the rest of international actors. And therefore, it also conditions its own actions. One of the latest most famous books, not new about this topic, but because of all of its effect, The Brussels Effect by Andrew Grothkos. she talks about irradiating legislation to the rest of the world. This is something I'd like you to keep in mind. But allow me to start because we want to finish on time at 11:15 on the dot, which is when this first session will be over. Let me ask you the questions from the audience. We will combine questions from members of the audience online and in-person members of the audience. I'm going to start with in-person audience members. There is one question here. Hello, good morning. My name is Luis Rodriguez from the radio show Connection with Europe. Mrs. Della Torre, in your presentation, you've talked about land transport and also sea transport. I'd like to ask you, what's the role played by air transport? We're here in Barcelona, and I'd like to ask you about the plans to enlarge the Barcelona airport. And first, the requirement letter presented by the EU in February for the protection of the natural area of the delta, the river delta, and how this fits with the plans that I've seen in the deal against climate change. Go ahead. Air transport was already part of the emissions market. What we're doing with this revision is to do two things. First, to articulate this emissions market with the international market, and this is related to what Paul asked. I'll come back to this in a second. And there's another very important initiative action, which is for fuels. The obligation of using alternative fuels in certain proportions and under certain conditions. Because nowadays we know that there isn't still a technology nowadays that allows us to have electrical planes of a certain size or hydrogen-based planes. They are being electrified, but there are technologies that allow us to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from fuels. So there is a proposal for that. I was saying that this is being articulated with the legislation, with the initiatives. You can't call them legislation internationally, because in the Civil Aviation International Organization, and the EU is one of its member states, there is a mechanism called CORSIA. And I shan't explain here the details of the mechanism, but the goal is to stop the emissions at the level of 2050. And the European Union's goal is to reduce them by 55%, and internationally too. Now, in that forum, just like in the Sea International Organization, the EU plays a leading role, pushing for the reduction of CO2 emissions. So the mechanisms that will be implemented will be credible and robust mechanisms so that there isn't any double accounting, so that they do not disturb unnecessarily neither mobility, and nor should they favor the emissions curve. Now, with regards to the enlargement of the Barcelona airport, I want to say that I do not know anything about it, so I will not answer about things I do not know. But I have to say that airports in general are also suffering very much from the pandemic. And beforehand, the European Association of Airports have undertaken a number of commitments in order to adjust their operations to the climate struggle. So we will have to see how that fits with their plans. Thank you. Now we have a question that comes from YouTube online. Alex Garder Taurina asks, how will we comply with the strict climate goals if we are not able to comply with our current limit? Okay, a short question, but with a very long answer. I do not agree that we're not able to comply with the current limitations. European legislation, the EU, as EU citizens, can feel proud of living in a part of the world in which we have legislation, not good-willed intentions, as in other parts of the world, that force us to have an emissions reduction by 2040 and by 2040 and by 2050. We have to increase our renewables consumption part. We have to increase our energy efficiency. And I have to say that for the emissions reduction and the increase of our renewables consumption, we are complying. We are complying with the current legislation. And with regards to the energy use too. Now with a new package, we will increase. So I do not agree at all with you, with what you have said. We are actually complying with the current limitations. What happens is that the EU allows a bit less than 10% of, we emit a bit less than 10% of all of the emissions in the world. So what's needed is for the rest of the world to move to, and that's a problem. As a whole, we are not complying with the limits. But the EU, in what it actually claims it wanted to do, we are complying with it. Thank you very much indeed. So let's go back to the in-person audience. Any other questions? Go ahead, please. Yes, good morning. My name is Charlie Lamarque, and I'm a student of politics and law at the Pompeu Fabra University. I agree with you. The weight of the ecological transition should not be paid by countries with lower resources. But in Barcelona, we have seen how a year ago, this low emissions zone has been implemented by the city council, and how that has not had the expected effects. The success has been quite low. And I'd like to know if the EU is rethinking about focusing its efforts on other sectors, not only against citizens in this case, but also highlighting more attractive incentives or more strict punishments against oil companies, large industries, etc. Well, I have to say one thing. The EU's policies is not enforced against anybody. Against anybody. We do not do it against citizens, ever. What happens is that first and foremost, we have the member states and the regions and the municipalities that we meet in a number of conferences. And we are all getting into new uncharted waters. There are some pilot experiences that work better than others, but it is such an in-depth transition that we have to give us some leeway, because if we do not give ourselves some leeway for error, I do not know about Barcelona's city plan, but if we do not allow ourselves some leeway for making mistakes, we will not innovate. If we want a 100% guarantee in what we start, we will not be ambitious enough, and we will not innovate. Thank you very much indeed. So let's go back to an online question. Claudia Gaspar Garcia. She asks if an instrument will be used to fight against the speculation with CO2 emissions rights within the European Green Deal. Emission rights, okay. It is a free market. As you know, part of the rights will be given for free, exactly in order to protect carbon leaks. Most of them. And the goal is to make all of these emission permits to be sold, to be placed in the market. And we will have public auctions continuously in platforms. And we have not observed, as I have said beforehand, any movement, any strange or weird movement, or any movement that do not respond to the market rationale. I have to say that the ETS system, that I didn't get into the detail of, it implies a number of mechanisms to compensate for the market's liquidity problems. And it actually vertebrates the use of these permits. But it is a free market. Thank you. There is another question. Go ahead, please.
Buenos días, soy Mar López, estudiante de...
My name is Mar Lopez. I study political science at the Barcelona University. I wanted to know, okay, you're focusing very much on the transport industry, but I don't know whether you have actually borne in mind that the meat industry and the fashion industry emit a large part of greenhouse effect gases, and they use a large part of natural resources like water, and the meat producing industry contributes to a large extent to deforestation. So, within the measures you're using for the transport industry, for example, with electric vehicles, what are you doing with the meat producing industry or the fashion industry? I mean, you have said that climate change could bring us to water warfare. To produce 1 kilogram of meat, you need between 5,000 and 20,000 liters of water. And to produce a pair of jeans, you need between 10,000 and 20,000 liters of water. So what are you applying for these industries? Okay, maybe we talk about the transport industry, because it's an example that's easily understood. But all industries contribute to this climate change, of course. Now, the agricultural and cattle raising industries are part of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, and it has been targeted with regards to our measures to combat climate change, with some ambitious proposals. And the Common Agricultural Policy has a clear climate dimension. And with regards to fashion and all other industries that contribute to climate change, we have the so-called EPS legislation, or the so-called effort sharing, which is being distributed by amongst member states. Let's not forget that we also have the circular economy strategies, which are particularly important for the fashion industry. There are awareness-raising campaigns. So each industry is included. Let's not forget one thing. We are transforming our economic system as well. Therefore, the system is thought out in such a way that emissions reduction will be starting in the places where the cost is the lowest. Of course, as in all cost reduction system, you start acting in those places where with €1 reduction, you have a multiplying effect. So the different industrial sectors will also apply this. Let's not forget that there are certain industries in which it takes 20 or 25 years to change the whole value chain that lies behind. We need to change everything, and that implies a change in the type of jobs, the type of work, and the type of training that workers need. So there are many, many transformations that we still need to do, but they can't be done overnight. Thank you very much indeed for that. So we go back. We have a few minutes left, but we still have time for a few questions, a few additional questions. Demo Garcia asks about electric car batteries. They also generate waste. How will this waste be managed? And Spain doesn't have the right infrastructure to implement that. What you said beforehand about green charge stations. This is very interesting because batteries clearly are a key point for electrical cars. And well, how do we manage that? How do we manage that waste? Well, through recycling. Batteries are being built up under the condition of being recyclable. And to recycle a battery, you need to have collection points to start, and they should be part of the ecosystem that exists or that lies behind any battery. You probably know that the European Union's Commission created 3 or 4 years ago the so-called Battery Alliance. Why? Well, because unfortunately, the battery production capacity in the EU had been delocated to Africa, and therefore we have a strategic technological fragility. And with this alliance, we're reconstructing a whole value added in the production of batteries. And as you have well said, one of the key elements is recycling. In these new batteries, we also have to think about the materials we use to build the batteries, either because they are scarce or else because some of them have to be come from countries in which workers' rights are not respected. So we have to change that too. And then the whole recharge system with a whole network of recharging stations. So the number of actions that have to be undertaken, well, it has to be all done at the same time and with great care. Excellent. Thank you for that. Any other questions in person? Okay. Clara, I'm going to group together the last 2 questions because time is up, and then I'm going to give you the floor to answer the last 2 questions. Good morning. I am an industrial production technician. The car manufacturing industry is already manufacturing thousands of electrical cars. They have stopped manufacturing diesel cars and gas-based cars. Now, the concern is in the water sector, wastewater. How can we have a proposal to have a wastewater treatment plant, both private and public? The second question, okay, thank you. My name is Julie, and I study global studies at the Pompeu Fabra University. My question is related to what has been said about the 2035 directive to start selling in the European space only electric cars and hydrogen cars. And I wanted to link this up with the recently approved directive, approved on the 3rd of July, in which we had to reduce, or we have to stop, one single-use plastic object. And on the 3rd of July, I read in the El País newspaper that only 8 out of the 27 member states had national directives to apply and implement this measure on the 3rd of July. The date was approved in Europe. So I wanted to ask you, what's the permeability of these borders established by the EU? And can we wait until 2035 to stop having the production of cars that are highly polluting? Thank you. Thank you. Clara, you have the floor for this. And then let's see if we have time, because there are many questions online. So with these 2 first questions, okay, with regards to cars, very quickly, in spite of the pandemic, the number of electric cars that have been placed in the market has been multiplied by 30, which means that car manufacturers have understood the signal. There is an increasing array of models and availability, in spite of the pandemic. With regards to the second question, sorry, I have forgotten it. I have made a note of it and I've lost it. It was about single-use plastics, right? Sorry, could you repeat? You have asked about plastic. Yes, right. Okay. By 2035, there will be no combustion cars. The new cars that will be launched by 2035, 100% of them need to be zero-emission cars, so that by 2050 there will be in the market there will be no circulation of combustion cars, internal combustion cars. I mean, it is a prohibition, and by 2035, no internal combustion cars will be placed in the market. With regards to single-use plastic objects, this is an initiative that was launched, and I don't know how many countries are ready to transpose that directive. But the EU will use all of the mechanisms available to enforce that directive. We have only 3 minutes left, so we will read 2 questions from the audience, and then the rest of the remaining questions that will have not been answered, we have a panel discussion afterwards, so we will get some of them. Belén Gutiérrez Carmona asks, how will you guarantee that citizens have the necessary means to renew their homes without having to pay for most of the cost? And Christian Beers asks, with regards to lithium extraction in Latin America, this is being done without any control whatsoever, and therefore the number of emissions is increasing with regards to lithium extraction. Well, with regards to Latin America, I can't answer. Maybe my colleagues in Madrid know more than I. Let me insist that the value chain that's being set up in the EU bears in mind what are the raw materials that are being used for the manufacturing of batteries and the places they come from in terms of the effects they produce in the natural environment and in the battery that's being built up. Okay, the first question is about the cost of home refurbishment. A new way of funds have been made available. There will be a lot of money for refurbishment costs, and many countries have given a support for this renewal and refurbishment wave. And they have started by placing an obligation to the public sector. I'm not exactly sure about the percentage, but there are a number of systems that are in the communication. But what's most important, the Social Climate Fund, it feeds from what's obtained from the buildings emissions market, and it will be used to support people who need it to actually contribute to the refurbishment and renewable costs. Thank you, Clara. As you can see, there is a lot of interest, and not only interest, but also in-depth knowledge. The public debate is well informed. There are many things that generate a lot of concern and interest, as could be otherwise. But at any rate, I thank you very much for your time and for being with us this morning, for your presence this morning. Thank you for your clear explanations and for having gone over most of the topics that are being discussed now and for the future with regards to the Green Deal. Now we will stop here to be punctual for those who are in person in the room and for people who are following us online. We will have a 15-minute break. We will come back at 11:30 on the dot. Thank you, Clara de la Torre, for your participation. Thank you. I hope you will keep on enjoying your holidays, and I'm sure that we will have another chance in the future to talk about all of these topics. Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Muy bien, pues bienvenidas y bienvenidos de nuevo a la sesión de debate posterior.
Welcome all again to our debate session, our first discussion with Clara de la Torre, very participative and interesting, and we already covered many of the subjects we'll be covering in this experts panel to talk about the Green Deal, the Fit for 55 strategy, and of course go beyond in the debates, the whole ecologic transition, green transition, and in a more global frame, which we were alluding to earlier as well. And for that, we have a panel, which is made out of, firstly, by Hannah Abdullah from Florence. She's a senior investigator at CEDOP, with a keen eye on everything related to the Green Deal, as well as a study dimension from the cities and the role of cities in the transition. And secondly, we have Gregor Erbach, who is a head of department of these studies and following on action for climate at the European Parliament. And he's also participating online. And then sitting next to me is Cristina Monge, which many of you already know. She's an executive advisor as well as an associate professor at Zaragoza University, very active both in generating knowledge and discussing knowledge on the matters that we're about to discuss, but also from action, from networks, coordination, and work from the civil society as it pertains to climate matters and beyond. And she's also a frequent guest in media. She often writes for the El País newspaper, and she has a long career in different media. So this is a very varied panel with many different perspectives.
Hannah and Gregor, what we will do first is an introduction by each of the speakers. So we will have 10 minutes, approximately 7 to 10 minutes, no more, of introductory remarks, building on what also Clara de la Torre put forward in her initial remarks and the discussion that took place before this session. And then we will engage with the audience. I know there were plenty of questions in the YouTube chat that remained to be answered due to the lack of time, but we will do our best to also take some of those questions again in this session or bring new ones. So without further ado, and taking into account that 1 sharp we need to finish with our discussion, let me give the floor first, and I will follow the order that's in the program, to Hannah Abdullah, as I said, senior researcher at CEDOP. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this very pressing issue, climate change and the Green Deal. I would like to go back to the Fit for 55 package, which has been really the big news this week. And if this package is accepted by the Parliament and Council, even if in an amended form, it will really radically transform life in Europe. And reading about the package yesterday in the German magazine Der Spiegel, I was struck by a distinction they made between the offensive and preventative laws it includes. And the offensive laws, here we could talk about efforts geared towards selling European green, technological and CO2-free products across the world. And Clara de la Torre already mentioned that that the Green Deal is an opportunity for innovation and growth. These more offensive laws are also about ramping up European soft power by setting new standards and leading by example, a point Paul also made earlier. But on the other hand, we have these more preventative laws, which are about ensuring the global competitiveness of Europe's economy and businesses, about preventing carbon leakage. And here I'm referring particularly to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Clara also mentioned briefly. And they're also about preventing social division and protests in response to future decarbonization policies. And here I'm referring in particular to the new social climate fund that has been proposed. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into the climate justice efforts of the Fit for 55 package and whether these go far enough. So one of the measures that has been put on the table with the Fit for 55 and that will most affect European citizens in their everyday life is the planned revision of the emissions trading scheme to include buildings and road transport, as Clara already raised earlier on. Why is this so significant? Because it will really affect the affordability of electricity, heat, and mobility. And this has been quite controversial. In terms of road transport, there have been concerns raised, including actually by Franz Timmermans, as far as I know, that this might risk pushing fuel prices up and hurting the poor. There's also fear that this might provoke protests like the Yellow Vests in France last year. And in terms of buildings, there are concerns that this may increase bills for tenants or owners who cannot afford to renovate their buildings in energy efficient ways. Now, the Social Climate Fund has been put on the table in a sense as an answer to these concerns. It's been designed to cushion the social consequences of the transition and to prevent further division in society. And the plan is, as Ursula von der Leyen announced on Wednesday in her speech, to support income and investment, to cut bills for vulnerable households and also small businesses, and to tackle energy poverty. The EU will put 70 billion into this fund, and it will then be co-financed by member states. But the crux for me really is that it's member states who will have to develop the schemes for how financial support will reach the most vulnerable and those in need. And I think we will see many inconsistencies arise across the schemes that will be developed by individual member states. And there's no doubt that we need to cut emissions from buildings and transport because, as Clara raised, they are high and far too high. But I'm not sure that marketizing these emissions is the right response if we want to ensure a just transition. And I'd be curious to hear what Gregor has to say on this and what the debates in Parliament are on this issue. The second point I'd briefly like to make is on citizen engagement and stakeholder engagement and everything that Clara has mentioned about the EU Climate Pact. So the Climate Pact is a very promising initiative. It aims to engage people, communities, organizations, and it wants to work through awareness raising. It also works with climate pledges. And most recently, the Climate Pact has announced ambassadors who can promote certain aspects of the Green Deal in their communities and networks. And these ambassadors come from different sectors. They include mayors, they include NGOs, business associations, also museum networks, for example, so cultural institutions. And in a sense, what this Climate Pact evokes for me is a new social contract founded on the shared concern for our planet. But the problem we're having is that uniting people behind this concern is difficult at a time when the European public is quite divided on climate policy. And wondering about how this can be done in a more effective way, I was asking myself what we can actually learn from the UN and the information and engagement campaigns they have been running on the SDGs for over 5 years now. And I think a lot can actually be learned here. So the SDGs have really arrived in very different sectors of society. They have become part of school and university curricula. Businesses now very naturally work with them. And I think the goal should be for the Green Deal to trickle down into society in a similar way. I think one of the reasons for why the SDGs have been so successful in reaching society is because they have been visually communicated. So we have these 17 icons and 17 colors, and this is a very powerful medium and very powerful images that are easy to work with for those who want to get on board and engaged. And I think what we need is better visual packaging of the Green Deal and its thematic priorities and goals. If you Google the Green Deal, you don't really find those iconic images that you can use if you want to spread the message. And I think this is something that's quite important. And I don't know, I think I've almost used up my 10 minutes. I'm happy to talk more about the role of cities and how they will be key for implementing the Green Deal later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, let's keep the cities part of the equation, an important part of the equation for the follow-up question that I will, of course, ask to the three of you in the second round. But first, let me turn to Gregor Erbach. Please, Gregor, for the introductory 10 minutes remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. I'm head of the Climate Action Research and Tracking Service in the European Parliament. It's a service that was founded a year ago after the Parliament declared a climate and environmental emergency. And its purpose is to enhance the analytical and research capacity on climate issues for members of the Parliament. First of all, I would like to clarify the 55% emission reduction target in the European climate law. And in fact, there are three different numbers that are mentioned. One is the 55% reduction of net emissions. There's a 52.8% number and a 57% number. Now, to explain that, the 55% reduction, that is net emissions. And net emissions, that means emissions of greenhouse gases minus removals of greenhouse gases. Those removals, they can come from natural sources, for example, trees, soils, and wetlands, or they can come from technological solutions, such as direct air capture of CO2 with carbon capture and storage. So that is the 55% target that has been proposed, a net emissions target. The Parliament had, in fact, requested a much higher ambition. That was a 60% cut of real emissions without counting the removals. And why 60%? That is because, according to the UN emissions gap report, the global emissions need to be cut by a certain amount to reach the keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, and a 60% reduction by 2030 is the EU's fair share in reducing emissions to reach this global emission reduction, assuming that everyone is allowed equal per capita emissions. Now, the fear on the side of the Parliament was that if you count removals as well as emission reductions, not enough effort might be made to actually reduce emissions, but to count on removals instead. And the problem with removals is that they may be limited over time, because forests, for example, can only absorb so much carbon, and after a while, as they grow older, their capacity is reached, so that those removals will go down. And for that reason, the Parliament suggested to limit the amount of removals that are allowed for the 55% target. And in fact, this is in the climate law now, that the contribution of the removals is limited to 255 megatons of CO2. And as a result, you must cut the actual emissions by 52.8% to reach the 55% target. Now, the third number that you hear is that the climate law actually achieves a 57% cut in emissions. And that is because in the proposed Fit for 55 package, there's a regulation on a revision to the regulation on land use change and forestry, LULUCF for short, which aims to expand the EU's natural carbon sink, so forests, wetlands, and soils, to achieve annual removals of at least 310 megatons. Now, if you deduct those additional removals, then the cut in net emissions is up to 57%. But this, of course, is not in the climate law, but this will be subject to agreement by the EU and the member states in the course of the legislative process. So we have those three numbers, 52.8, 55, and 57. And that is also why the Parliament does not call this new package Fit for 55, but calls it Fit for 2030. But it's in fact the same package, just two different names for it. Now let me get to the challenge of reducing emissions and achieving climate neutrality by 2030. There's two aspects to it. One is the depth of emission reductions that are necessary, and also the speed at which emissions must be reduced. To put that into perspective, the economic crisis and shutdowns due to the coronavirus pandemic last year, that led to a drop in emissions by around 7%. And now a similar level of emission reductions will have to be achieved every year to reach the 55% target and eventually get to climate neutrality. And that is an immense speed up and strengthening of the effort compared to the around 1.5% annual cuts that have been achieved over the previous 15 years. And I was quite surprised how the discussion had shifted so that there was serious discussion about whether a 55% cut is ambitious enough or not. That shows that the discussion has shifted a lot over the past years, and that we are indeed facing a climate emergency where we have to act quickly, and business as usual is not an option anymore. There's two perceptions of the emission reductions. One perception is that we know how to do it because the EU has cut emissions by 25% since 1990. So we just need to do more of the same, more renewable energy, more energy efficiency, changes in agricultural practices, and then eventually we will get there. But the other view is that the low-hanging fruit have already been picked. The relatively easy things like changing light bulbs, like changing to more efficient furnaces for heating, putting wind and solar power in favorable locations, and so on. And now it will become harder and harder to achieve every additional % of reduction. An example of this are heavy good transport and aviation, which cannot be electrified easily, the production of steels, chemicals, and concrete, which rely on fossil fuels, or emissions from livestock and fertilizers in agriculture. And in order to decarbonize these difficult sectors, a new industrial revolution is needed that would include, among others, the use of hydrogen for transport, chemicals and iron and steel, extensive electrification, a circular economy, and a shift in agricultural production. And all of this while keeping the EU's industry competitive and ensuring that there's not only enough money, but also the resources that are needed, for example, for building batteries, the infrastructure, and the skills. And I will end here and give to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gregor. Directamente, Cristina, te paso la palabra y después...
All right, Christina, you have the floor, and then we'll retake some of the aspects. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. Good morning. Leave me to put a series of issues on the table in this dialogue, both with Clara's keynote speech as well as with my panel colleagues just said. So first, I wanted to state an evidence that we often overlook because we live in very fast time. Oh, I'm going to set a timer, by the way. We live in very fast times and we often lose perspective. I don't know if you remember, but not even 2 years ago, a year and a half exactly, at the Madrid Climate Summit, which was celebrated in December 2019, so not even 2 years ago, I insist, we suddenly got Ursula von der Leyen, who'd just been appointed president of the Commission, to make an announcement which was completely revolutionary at the time, the European Green Deal, which is something that now looks like business as usual. It's something we're over with. It's been here forever, but it isn't even 18 months old. And not only that, but I confess, I was one of those who, when the pandemic struck, I thought every advance we'd made to put environmental aspects in the political debate would all be moved to the back burner, because the pandemic would require an amount of knowledge, talent, and investment that all these environmental issues would be completely forgotten about. So in that moment, within the European Union, everyone was betting on the European Green Deal, but there were countries like Hungary or Poland who immediately brought up, well, this environmental climate change thing is nice, but we're in an economic crisis right now, so let's work on the economy. Let us burn some more coal, and then we'll see what happens. And there was something similar going on in Spain. We had a government that kept announcing its will to approve a climate change law and to be very ambitious in that sense. At the same time, we had autonomic communities under different political aspects who were saying the same thing that was going on in Europe. Yes, this is all fine and dandy, but we're in an economic crisis now. Let us recover our economies, and later we'll see. And then we saw how many executives at the autonomic level, many governments, the first thing they did was downgrade the criteria and the environmental demands on public policies with the pretext of economic recovery. So there was some tension already, and that tension is now solved. And the way in which it was solved was the Next Generation program, where we're told that 140,000 million euros are used to modernize Spanish economy. This says for the Spanish case. And what does it mean to modernize the economy? And the Commission tells us two things. It means to digitalize and to re-greenify. And a year ago, which I was telling you about, the European Green Deal was something completely revolutionary. But just now look at how far we've come in that time. So what first I wanted to do was to really highlight how far we've come, thanks to how quickly life moves and how the pandemic moves. We often forget about this. And where are we right now? So right now we find ourselves in a time where I think, thinking about what Clara said and my colleague said, I think about 5 points for discussion. Number one, is this an ideological debate? And let me explain. We've often said climate change doesn't have an ideology. It's not right-wing, left-wing. Obviously, yes, the scientific diagnosis on what's going on in the biosphere are there. However, the green transition does have an ideology. And we can have a green transition with more or less ingredients of social justice, with more or less emphasis on the market or on the civil society, or with a larger impact on social protection, etc., etc. Sometimes when I bring this up, I'm being told that I'm looking after my own, and it's true. But I believe we find ourselves in one of the largest ideological discussions in the early 21st century. How do we tackle the green transition from different ecologic perspectives, ideologic perspectives? That's the first point. Second point, my colleagues talked about the fair transition. A couple of weeks ago in Spain, we had a quite funny case, we could say, which I like to say is quite idiosyncratic of what this transition could be, which was these debate over the meat consumption. Why do I bring this up? Because I'm not being frivolous. I think it was a perfect encapsulation of many of the discussions that we will encounter. And a scientifically backed argument from the point of view of health, of environment, of water consumption that someone in the floor was bringing up earlier. So this is something that is completely scientifically based on what we need to do. And immediately we saw polarization of the conflict. On the one hand, we had the economic side. What happens with people of the meat rearing industry? What if their production is down? What's going to happen with that whole economic sector? That transition needs an answer. Number two, a class economic elites related. When the Minister for Consumption came out and said, we need to eat less meat and of better quality, social networks were all ablaze with answer, well, that's obviously for those that may afford good meat because all I can afford is like hormone-laden chicken. And I excuse the joke, but we have a polarized conflict in this case that exemplify really well what's going to happen when we talk about sustainable mobility, when we talk about energy efficient, when we talk about the use of water, when we talk about city models and every other model that we'll encounter. Number one, the transition of the affected economic sectors, and then how green transition cannot be seen as something that only affects the elite, because in that case, we will not be able to happen. The shadow of the yellow vests, as has been brought up in earlier interventions, is very clear. So the third element up for debate, if the pandemic has taught us something, is that we live in a completely interdependent world. Anything happening in the world is to generate effects in the planet as a whole. Fit for 55 in the European Union, I think, does very well to set these questions when it comes to the adjustment mechanisms concerning borders. But how is it going to affect the developments of the population that give us many of the products that we use every day, the denim that we wear, part of our food, many of the components with which we make the solar panels that we want to put on our rooftops? What's going to happen to all that? And what I'm missing there is incorporating a socially minded and equity-minded analysis, because this is not only a fair transition for Europe, it needs to be fair for the whole planet. And I think that's something that we're often missing in our analysis. The fourth matter, issues of growth. Clara was talking about it, and I really, deep down, I agree. We cannot have a green transition linked to impoverishment. We want to change in order for all of us to live better, those who are here now and those who will come. That's the ultimate goal of change, that we all live better. However, can we still consider the idea of growth in the same way we have since the neoclassical economical theories? Perhaps we need to turn the notion of growth on its head, because up until now, enrichment and development have been differentiated, and that's something that in classical economy is very easy to do. It's something rather hackneyed in that sense. But maybe it's time to turn these concepts on their head so that we may incorporate whatever is useful in the idea of development and the idea of growth in a way that may be useful for all this. So there's a big theoretical growth into how we conceive growth and how we conceive development. And the last matter before I run out of time, and this is just, I want to be really provocative here, is to debate a change in habits. The matter of a change in habits with a green transition, I have a feeling it's the same as education in many aspects, because you're debating a really complex subject in a debate like this in the classrooms, you know, or just over coffee with friends. You're discussing something that's very complex. And when you no longer know how to keep on discussing because it's so complex that you don't know how to keep on, there's a very easy way out to say, oh, it's all a matter of education. Just, can I have another coffee, please? Done. So we just forget, you know, we leave the resolution of problems to that and we just leave it there. And obviously it is an issue of education, as it is with many of the challenges that we're facing. But let's move a little forward. A change in habits. To change society's habits, it's one of the hardest things to do, especially in rich, stable societies as ours. But you're going to say, well, we change our habits all the time. Look at the pandemic. Yes, indeed. Well, when did we change our habits? When material conditions pushed us towards it. And I'm going to set a series of examples that I think you'll all understand very quickly. Right now, we're saying, and I think it's good news, that the myth of the car, which you and I had when we finished our college degree, and I think many of us here, it was this great thing to get your license and the car that was access to an adult life and independence and all that. Well, that has radically changed. And I think that's good news, that right now, for young people, that is no longer a myth. They prefer other ways to move that are much more sustainable and much cheaper and much more rational. Why? How did that change come about? Has there been a great sensibilization campaign of how disastrous it is that each of us has a car in a garage, guzzling gasoline, or because an economic crisis came together with digital alternatives that put cars for hire, BlaBlaCar in Spain, the different platforms for mobility, while at the same time, cities have made a conscious bet for collective sustainable mobility. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, okay, done. And I insist, that's a very clear example. What did really bring about this change? Did we sort of become possessed by the spirit of sustainability, or did we just encounter a series of axes? Were we just at an intersection of material axes that pushed us towards that change? And we could set many similar examples on many subjects. I'm just going to leave it there as food for thought. Education and awareness are key, but they're not everything we need for a change in habits. We need something that push them with public policies that allow us to escalate, public transport, mass transit, as we were talking about, and technological alternatives that make that transition possible. I'm going to leave it there, these 5 points up for debate. All right. Well, thank you very much. Indeed, with every remark, there are many things that come up for the debate. Personally, and I'm going to take advantage of my role as a moderator to add on to what Cristina was saying right now, and also Hannah earlier, and I think Gregor also made some references to 2 points. Also to, kick off the debate with you first and then with our audience. The first is this link between the green transition and a fair and inclusive transition, which is something that we've looked at from different lenses this morning, as well as the recovery fund and the link with the European Recovery Fund. There's one matter that worries me especially, which is at the beginning of debates over the European Recovery Funds, we encountered these updates of classically social democratic recipes on the role of states, public investment, public expense, as mechanisms to improve the population, the conditions of the population, which has suffered and is still suffering the effects of the pandemic. And we're taking us back to these very well-known recipes within economic theory. The United States, paradoxically, took that recipe at first, an infrastructure plan, labor plan, many public resources at the disposal of the economy to reactivate in a rather classical fashion economic growth. However, on the other hand, the European Union back then, and that's, laudable, but now's the time to transform the economy as we recover. That's the green digital transformation, which will be the pillars of a stronger, more internationally competitive standard, something that sets us at a strong position internationally. So let's transform first so we may play a stronger role later. That's all nice, very nice. But while the United States were putting on the table a recipe that takes us back to full employment, the EU is saying, we'll get to full employment in the future once these changes have been implemented, and will transform our productive sectors. In the meantime, there's an important race to adapt to that new productive model, which is to say, production sectors in Europe and the production network and businesses in Europe are largely small and medium-sized businesses. And we could look at every index of every member state, and we'll see how the distribution between large and small businesses is rather similar. Everyone in all of Europe, the productive sector lies mostly with the small businesses. What's different is what these small businesses bring to the output, the gross domestic product in each country. Some of them have larger businesses that generate more richness, and others like Spain, where most of its productive network and the generation of resources is in the hands of small and medium-sized businesses. Well, for me, the problem is that when we want to undertake this digital and green transformation of our economy, there are a series of sectors that basically they're waiting for the moment to go back to the previous moment, just so they can access the riches they stopped generating, the benefits that they stopped generating, that stopped pouring into their family economy during the months of pandemic. And I see a great contradiction there. The way I see it, the recovery fund, the way it is being structured, strengthens that risk. And we may think that large businesses will have large attraction And that traction may make it so that medium-sized and small businesses can join them to kickstart these funds, the PERTE and the existing mechanisms. But I wonder how, a mechanical workshop with just 2 workers, 2 partners, may be effectively able to get onto this traction on the large companies. It's going to be really hard for them because their productive model is based on earlier times. And the incentives for reform are very low because they know they have a huge investment ahead of them if they want to transform their business model. And perhaps in the 10, 12 years that mechanic shop may have in the future, maybe it's not worth it to them to make that investment. So here's an element that I think is key, which is the inclusivity of the recovery plan, the recovery funds, which for now, at least as it is being kickstarted in Spain, the emphasis has been greater on the extraction and the PERTE projects and much lower in the decentralization and the trickle down of those funds into really productive economy in this country and its productive structure. That's just a doubt in my mind, a question I have. I would like to think that after this initial effort of coming up with submitting projects to Brussels based on these great transformative projects, that after this, there's going to be a great decentralizing effort of open public calls. So whoever wants to apply to these call at, let's say, the Barcelona City Council or something, may add to that huge resource pool. So if we haven't started doing that yet, I'm afraid we may be running late, because it would have been nice to do this from the beginning, because that might be the easiest or the most feasible way to do it. But that's a great challenge ahead of us. If you go to any small businesses, they're going to know zilch about the recovery models. They're going to know about that the moment when they can submit their projects for funding, which as of now has not happened. And that's my first thought. The second one I'm going to save for later. So I'm going to start another round with Hannah, starting on the role of cities, which has a lot to do with the inclusivity in economy, because after all, productive networks are largely in cities, and that's where we can move forward. So we're starting another round and then talk about different things. Hannah.
Yeah, so Clara mentioned at the beginning of her talk that the Green Deal is not only about climate protection, about biodiversity regeneration, etc., but it's also an opportunity for innovation and growth. And much of this innovation and growth will take in place in Europe's cities, because they are the hubs of the economy, they are the hubs of innovation, but they're also leading on climate experimentation. And some of these cities, like especially in Northern Europe, like Copenhagen, Stockholm, etc., they actually have more ambitious climate goals than the European Union. And one of the new Horizon Europe missions, which has been mentioned earlier, the Climate Neutral and Smart Cities mission, actually supports this pioneer role of cities as experimentation laboratories. So what this Horizon mission has done, they have proposed to support 100 cities in their systemic transformation towards climate neutrality already by 2030, not 2050. And basically what this proposal recognizes is that cities have the capacity to act as pioneers and lead on the Green Deal. And they have this because they, in a sense, are the optimal scale for climate experimentation and also for technological innovation, but also innovation in policy. Cities are large enough to test and pilot new ideas before upscaling them, but they're also small enough to discard these new ideas at a lesser cost if they don't work out. And one important role that cities will play is to more effectively connect the green and digital transitions. So for example, there are quite a few sort of pioneer cities that are now experimenting with creating more integrated and circular energy systems that are more decentralized, that empower the consumer, that are more flexible, And all this is done through the use of smart sensors and other technology. And with 75% of Europe's population living in urban areas, cities will really play a key role in making the Green Deal a reality. So much on cities, but I would also like to respond to the concerns you raised just now about how just can this transition be, and whether the European approach of trying to transform our economy while also recovering it will really be able to include everyone and not leave the small and medium-sized businesses that you mentioned behind. There definitely is a risk, but I think there's also a risk in not trying to change our current economic model, which we know is faulty and we know it is doomed. We cannot continue the way we are consuming now, the way we are emitting now, if we want to secure the future of this planet. And in the end, it will be more costly to recover the current system and then try to change it in 10 or 20 years' time than to recover and change it at the same time. It's a huge challenge, and Europe is clearly taking a risk here. But there's also the potential of, as we mentioned earlier, setting an example, moving ahead of the curve, and really driving innovation. And I think one of the measures that has been mentioned earlier, the renovation wave, which is part of the European Green Deal, is in a way a good example of how we can try and support small and medium-sized businesses and at the same time trigger a change in the let's say, operationality of our economy. So the renovation wave is about basically trying to make Europe's building or building stock more energy efficient, using more sustainable building materials, etc. And this particular measure is not only about climate, but it's also about boosting the construction sector, which really suffered during the COVID crisis. So on the one hand, we're trying to make our buildings more energy efficient and sustainable, but we're doing this while also putting a lot of money in the construction sector, which consists very much of small and medium-sized businesses, and helping them to innovate and start working with new materials, new technologies, etc. So yeah, that's just an example I wanted to provide for how we can link recovery and reform.
Thanks, Hannah. Gregor, any additional inputs on how to secure this just and fair transition while reforming our economies and societies? Gregor, your mic is muted.
Yes, thank you. The question of just transition, it's also, of course, a question, as Christina mentioned already, a transition that's fair for the whole planet. And in fact, we know already that the nationally determined contributions of the different parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they are at the moment not sufficient to reach the 2-degree temperature goal, let alone 1.5 degrees, but they more or less come out to 3 degrees. And for this is driven not only by industrial countries, but also to a large degree by developing countries like India and China that still have a lot of growth ahead of them and that do not have absolute emission reduction targets like the developed countries under Annex 1 of the convention, but that have targets that are relative to economic growth or targets that are relative to projections, business as usual projections. And the challenge, of course, for the upcoming COP26 is getting developing countries also on board to achieve, basically net zero emissions by the second half of the century, but it's very difficult at the moment because there is a promise from developing countries to provide $100 billion of climate finance annually by 2020, and that promise has not been met, and that of course makes the negotiations to improve emission targets much more difficult. And indeed, many of the NDCs of developing countries, they are conditional NDCs, which are conditional on the provision of adequate finance in order to finance the transition. And that finance is not available at the moment. And I also want to come back to Christina's point about a change in habits. And I can think of two examples where we have seen a successful change of habits, and maybe those can serve as inspirations how to change habits also for the transition towards climate neutrality. One is the example of smoking, which used to be a very cool thing to do, but is now completely socially unacceptable, despite all the best efforts of the tobacco industry to keep that from happening. But that is, for example, not the case with activities that are damaging the climate, such as driving big cars or flying long distances. And that could be one thing. And the other transformation is, of course, the digital transformation, which has completely changed the way we communicate, shop, travel, and entertain ourselves. And this is a transition that happened very quickly over just a few decades. Now everyone has a smartphone to go about their daily business and to keep in touch. This was not planned centrally and done by market forces. And I think some lessons could be learned from that transition and how it can be applied to the transition towards carbon neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Cristina, otro apunte respecto a esto y después pasaremos ya
Cristina,
casi.
make another note on this, and then we're going to move on, I think, to questions from the audience. Yes, I have a couple of issues that have come out, starting with this habit changes. Indeed, in Spain also, we had several examples that are quite peculiar in how fast we change in habit. And one is indeed tobacco, another one in traffic accidents. And all of them came together with a legislative change. There was a change in the law that reinforced that change in habit. So I would always like to highlight the role of public policies in this kind of issues. And linking with other things that have been said, at a time when we need a change in scale, we need speed. 11 years ago, science, the IPCC started saying on climate change matters, we're 11 years away from no being able to turn back in key aspects. And that was 3 years ago. We still have 8. We can't change. We can't wait a lot more. There's no chance. There's no time to wait. We need to activate and push every lever of change at the same time in the same direction for them to be effective. And I wanted to say the same on the issue of cities. Clara de la Torre was talking about emissions, which I think are a fundamental instrument to get changes, scale changes, because the emissions, as you know, there are different ones in the European Union, one that is specifically geared towards cities. And that's something that may put on the table a methodology that must allow to scale up and go forward much quicker, increase the speed of change. And I believe this is a model that deserves all our attention and that it deserves the effort of public, private, social, academic, the academia and the world of knowledge to jointly tackle those missions. And at the city sphere, as Hannah was saying earlier, I think that's key. And something else about what you were saying, Paul, on the next generation issue. Indeed, I believe we all share that worry with regards to economic structure, such as we may have in Spain or other countries. You know that Next Generation Plan implies committing expenses to 3 years and executing them within 6. And in real terms, that's tomorrow. And I think we need to see this in terms of opportunity. I think this is a great opportunity to multiply our social capital. And let me explain. These PERTEs, the first of which was announced this week on, automobile, with a great role here in Catalonia, have been taken, they've taken a lot of headlines. They seem like this big, everyone wants one of these. Because these are all complex figures whose details very often are still up for definition. And beyond them, we need and we will have other instruments. Some of these transformation tools will be things we already have, like investments, the competitivity regime that we already know, because that's the business as usual model to work from the public administration. But others are instruments and tools that are being created right now. And where's the challenge there? Well, it's like we're changing the wheel while the car is still running. So we're generating these instruments that we still don't know what they're going to look like and how they're going to work while things are still up and running. What do we do with this little mechanic shop that you were talking about earlier with the small family enterprise? Because big companies like car builder SEAT will have access to the funds to remodel themselves and get into this wave, as will Volkswagen or the Polytechnic University in Barcelona. I'm just naming names here. I'm not sure if we have anyone from that university here. But the small company, mom and pop shop, will not have that chance. So it is up for those territories that have the social capital, that have networks that may implicate even the smallest companies, the smallest businesses. In the case of Catalonia and in the case of Navarra and the Basque Country, these are territories with large social capital because there's a strong cooperative culture. Because for many years, they have cultivated this collaboration and support or simply information structures at the business level. In other parts of Spain, that is not the case. And I think what we need to ask from the Next Generation funds and from the government of Spain, once they start setting up this fund, is to dedicate part of the resources to support the creation and consolidation of that social capital that will enable everyone to be able to access those kinds of funds and policies. Otherwise, which is everyone's fear, that this is all going to stay with the greed companies, that may become a reality, even when we're talking about the small and medium companies, because what Spain defines as a small, medium size can range from 2 people to 199, which for 199 people business, it may be a little easier to insert themselves into that wave, but not for the 2-person business, as long as they don't enter those structures of social capital. And that puts on the table this matter of access barriers in this country, which often have a lot to do with the ability to acknowledge and even get to know whoever they need to speak to in the social administrator to get information and to approach these funds. And this is something we all know very well from the think tank sector, the access mechanisms to public power and political power need to be fostered. We must never take them for granted. There needs to be a contact, there needs to be a follow-up, there needs to be a meeting and then another meeting. So this mom and pop shop is going to have it much harder to access that. And I think this is a key aspect, and to do that in 3 years, it's a challenge with a capital C. So in the previous session, we didn't have a lot of time for questions. So I suggest we move on immediately to questions from the room and from the audience online. So who would like to start here in the room? Is there anyone? Otherwise, I'll just move on online because I know we have a lot of... Okay, so let's give people in the room some time. Christina, please, do you have a question? Both Maria Huascas and Eric Cauchy are saying that the Green Deal seems to not putting an emphasis on not exploiting the resources globally. Sorry, I'm not of the Global South, you said? It doesn't put enough emphasis on the reduction of exploiting resources in the Global South. All right? Okay, anyone? Hannah, Christina, Gregor? Who dares to tackle the question? I'm sorry, I can't see you on the screen. Hannah.
On the global south?
Yeah, I mean, I think the European Climate Pact, the way it was conceived, it's primarily a domestic mechanism. I think it's primarily about engaging organizations, citizens, communities within Europe. I think the task lying ahead now for the Commission is to align its external policy, its global strategy with the Green Deal. And that is being done these months. It started, but I think this is a task that will be that will busy the Commission this year and probably the next year. So, and this is also where, in a sense, global climate justice needs to be addressed and tackled. So the EU Climate Pact, I don't think it's the right place to look for these kinds of efforts and policies. What we need to look towards is the EU's external action plan and how this will be changed in the upcoming months.
Gregor, if you'd like to come in, just let me know, because I can't see you on screen now, but would you like to come in at this point?
Yes, there are 2 points I would like to add regarding the resources from the Global South. One is that the EU is striving toward a circular economy, which would first of all diminish the need for resources by using them more efficiently, but also diminish the need for importing resources by reusing and recycling them inside the EU. And there are some other aspects that have been very important in EU policy regarding resources from the Global South. One is deforestation, of course. And for that, there is an action plan to reduce imported deforestation, which can be directly for forest products, but can also be through land use change by importing agricultural products that would result in deforestation. And this has also been a big aspect in connection with biofuels, where we have now sustainability criteria for biofuels to make sure they do not come from sources like palm oil that also results in deforestation in certain regions. But there's also, on the side of the EU, of course, the concern to keep an industry and to have enough resources to keep the EU industry competitive. And the typical example, of course, here is batteries, which are needed for decarbonization for electric vehicles, but also as storage batteries on the grid to balance renewable energies. And there we have the issue of the fact that at the moment, most batteries are imported into the EU from China. So if the European car industry goes all electric, like much of the value chain would be outside of Europe. So that's why we have a battery initiative and also initiatives to secure the supply of critical materials like lithium and cobalt, while at the same time avoiding to import raw materials that are linked to child labor and ecological damage.
Thanks, Gregor. Paso a la sala si hay alguna pregunta, y si no, retomamos.
Okay, I'm giving the word to the floor in case there are questions, and otherwise we have still, oh, there's a question right there in front. Hi, good afternoon. My name is David Calvo. I'm a biology student at the Montpellier University in France. And my question is generally, maybe not so much about politics, but I would like to know whether in this green transition, if you're keeping in mind fostering rural life, because I'm very familiarized with the depopulation of Spanish regions like Teruel, and I have a feeling that often everyone wants to be sustainable and everyone wants to be green, but from a comfort of a brick city. Thank you. And that has a lot to do with the urban-rural divide and how we reconcile that. Do you have something to say, Cristina? All right, go ahead. Take it away. Let's go around the round in the opposite way. Well, this is a subject that it would take me 3 months to develop. No joking. It is one of the most complex issues we're facing right now. Because this is a matter that it doesn't only affect Spain, as you well know, because you're studying in France. It really transcends, I don't know if every country, but at least to my knowledge, many European and Western countries. There's a complex debate on this, and I would say we need to tackle it without prejudice, and we need to tackle it in all its complexity, because indeed, in Spain, for instance, the claims of the empty Spain, which is something that has already been brought to the forefront, it has had lots of headlines, and by the way, with very important ramifications at the political spectrum, on very short term, which means that there will be a lot of short-term attention on this, politically speaking, and we can talk about that. But just in terms of electoral projection, it sets up a scenario where the political color of the next government in Spain will be played in empty Spain, quote unquote. So what this is going to do is for the debate to be particularly interesting the last few times, and to be indeed highly positioned on sustainability matters. And I think this is a debate that we need to tackle in all its complexity, I insist, and without hypocrisy, because there starts to be this feeling that everyone has this idealization. Oh, did I do something? Sorry. So everyone has this romantic vision of going back to the countryside, but then things aren't easy. And allow me just to be very colloquial here. Every time the matter comes up with a group of friends where the politically correct thing to say is, oh, yes, we need to go back to small towns, to the countryside. And I always ask, how are you setting up your children? Are you setting them up to have the kind of education that may make it easy for them to move to a small town or a village? Or are you gearing them towards education that may allow them to get jobs in medium-sized or big towns? Because we need to be brave and keep our contradictions in mind. In Spain, the problem of territorial imbalance is huge. And here's a fact for you. I live in the town of Zaragoza. In Aragon, 10% of the surface is 10% of the surface of Spain. 1,100,000 people, out of which 700,000 live in Zaragoza. Teruel has regions with a population density similar to the Sahara Desert. That's the situation. And going off of that, let's think, what are we doing? What things did we do that did not work? Because there's a lot of money that has been invested in policies that did work, others that did not work at all, and others that only work partway. So let's evaluate the policies that have been implemented and think about this discussion in all its complexity. I think we need to overcome the countryside city divide, but we can't do that today. We need to think along those lines while keeping in mind that short term, we need different solutions, because we can't abolish that today. What we need to do is to keep bringing up this debate, and we would be very ill-advised to just close it with something like, oh, let's all go back to the countryside, because who here wants to go back to the countryside? Myself, my children? So let's face these contradictions, because that is key. It is true that politologists often like that phrase, correlation does not mean causality, but there's a high predictive element. During the Yellow Vest protests in France was the distance between basic essential services and the people demonstrating and protesting with regard to their access to health services, leisure. So the larger the distance, the larger the dissatisfaction, and therefore the larger reason for protest, so to speak. So that has a lot to do with that. Not necessarily the only cause, certainly, but it's one of the aspects that carry a lot of weight in this divide.
rural-urban divide that I know that you're working on from the cities program. But let me first, if you have something to say, keep it for you. And let me first turn to other questions that we have. And then I give you the floor and you catch up with these or other questions. So online, Cristina.
Jordi Closa pregunta, ¿no se va a ver
Jose Close is asking, won't the competition in the US be affected in front of other industrialized countries with less aggressive environmental laws that may make some companies to move to other less aggressive areas such as Asia? So yes, the capacity that Clara de la Torre was putting on the table with ambitious regulations, we risk this leak of companies towards other territories. So it's something that we already know, in fiscal matters at the European level. Okay, let's ask another question if you have any others, and we can then move on to a round of answers. Alex Arde is asking, the same way that US financial law is applied extraterritorially and is applied to other countries, couldn't Europe's environmental laws be applied the same way? Okay, so that question pertains to the application of EU law as a normative, a standard setter. And how these climate strategy may be adapted outside of the EU. Hannah and Gregor, we'll move back to Christina later if she has anything else to add. So let's move on.
Well, maybe to start with the rural-urban divide and whether there are any efforts to incentivize rural life. So, I mean, Cristina talked about this in the sort of Spanish case and in more general terms, and the difficulty of incentivizing a return to rural regions. I'm going to address this more in terms of the Green Deal and the concrete measures that are being planned. And I think one interesting case here is the farm to fork strategy, so the food strategy of the Green Deal, which is about creating more sustainable, more local and more resilient food systems. And one aspect where this relates to the rural-urban interconnection or divide is that there are plans to better integrate local food production and food consumption, so to better link food production in cities with the food production in the surrounding areas. So I think here's sort of one interesting case where there is an effort being made to strengthen the rural-urban link. Another case is the Just Transition Fund, which is directed especially at those regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, that rely on carbon-intensive industries, many of which are more, well, let's say suburban or rural. And there is also quite a bit of investment planned in these regions to modernize infrastructure and to support these regions in the transition towards other economic models and sources of income. The second question about the competitiveness of the European Union and businesses. Yeah, I mean, this is a major challenge, and the main law that is that was proposed as part of the Fit for 55 package with regard to this is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically tries to prevent carbon leakage and tries to ensure the competitiveness of European businesses by imposing a tax on imported goods that don't comply with the environmental standards of the European Union. But of course, this will cause major tensions in trade. It will also be hard to push this through in accordance with the standards of the World Trade Organization. So I think here we will see in the upcoming months how watertight the proposals of the Fit for 55 package are. Thanks.
Gregor?
Yes, about applying EU rules extraterritorially. There are basically four ways that this is done. One is through the setting of standards, for example, the rules for eco-design and energy efficiency of appliances, where foreign manufacturers are then interested in meeting the EU standards in order to have access to the EU market and its 500 million consumers. The second instrument is rules for product imported into the EU. For example, rules on forest products, ensuring that they come from sustainable forestry, or the sustainability criteria for biofuels, which ensure that biofuels imported into the EU respect certain standards. Then there is the instrument of trade agreements to give free trade agreements to countries that at the same time in the trade agreement commit to respecting certain environmental standards and even implement the Paris Agreement on climate change. And finally, there's instruments like the already mentioned carbon border adjustment, which would put a price on the greenhouse gas emissions of imported products and materials.
Muy bien, thank you, Gregor. ¿Hay alguna pregunta más en
Is there any other question in the room that we may not have answered? We gathered some from the previous session online. Oh, Res, we have a question. Hi, I'm Ariadna Güell, and I wanted to go back to one of the subjects that Cristina put on the table earlier on the issue of growth, how it is the idea of growth is being rethought with this new European project. And this is a subject that has kept coming up, which is the communication of the European Union. How do we communicate everything that we're doing? And I see a certain risk for contradiction. Clara has very clearly presented the Green Deal as a strategy for growth, whereas consumers or citizens are being asked to do quite the opposite, to consume less, to move less, to do it responsibly, etc. So I see that the concept is not really clear, and I wonder if that makes us be running the risk of just greenwashing for industries where we'll really be seeing a difference. And this is what we were saying earlier. Are these mom and pop shops or small businesses going to arrive there? And I think at the communications level, there's a problem, and right from the onset of it not being very clear, that may have bad ramifications or serious ramifications. I completely agree. There's a risk in the communication because there's a risk in the conceptualization because this is unclear. Let's think about something. For many years, these ideas for degrowth have been brewing, so to speak. And I believe that with the pandemic, that kind of approach have had a bigger echo. They were listened to more. I'm very critical with degrowth theories because degrowth may be unsustainable, right? The crisis in 2008 ended up with unsustainable degrowth, and we'll see what happens with the pandemic. But if we take stock from today towards the back, we find ourselves in a completely unsustainable degrowth. The levels of poverty have risen as they did in the Great Depression, and inequality has shot up through the roof. Is that the kind of degrowth that we want? No, certainly not. But however, if we take into account that there are certain sectors that will have to degrow and others that will need to grow, maybe we'll start to understand the matter a little better. We will not solve this just on a conceptual discussion on growth and degrowth because it implies a lot more. And I think we're only getting started with that discussion. What you're saying is true. With the discussion, with that open discussion, we haven't reached a minimum point of consensus. We suddenly start this European Green Deal, which isn't really telling you to consume less, the Green Deal. But what we are perceiving is that that's what we're being told, because we associate the green ideas to these less consumption ideas. They're very strongly linked in everyone's imagination. And we see that in opinion polls or in perception studies. That's something that always comes out. Green equals less consumerism. And that's difficult. But I think the challenge is it's not to consume less, it's to consume differently. For instance, I want growth in the care economy. Everything having to do with the care economy needs to grow in Europe. Sectors relating to education, knowledge, managing, they need to grow, and other sectors need to degrow. And this is a debate that we're only getting started on. And I believe there's a confusion there, and that's what we're giving off, because there's a confusion in concepts. And I often very provocative saying that communication problems don't exist. And I mean only that provocatively. Because we're often talking about communication problems when the problem is in the concept itself. It's not that you're not communicating well. It's just that the issue, the concept is unclear. And I think we're really, pointing at one of the key points. That's one of the things that we need to tackle. At the same time, yesterday I was having a similar debate on this matter. We're starting to see very strongly collapse theories, which I think deserve attention, as they diagnose the mood of a certain part of the population. And again, I'm very, very critical with those theories. I think it's very hard if going off of that to find ways that may help us find a solution, but there they are. And I think it's important to know them and study them at least. And they're still moving very fast in a very short span of time. And I think that's one of the key aspects of this transition that only makes it more difficult. Yes, and besides, on this collapse theories issue, I'm always afraid of the theory, which are the complacency theories. Everything will crumble. It's all going to be a big disaster. That's harmful in many ways for a big part of the population. But then there's the matter which I think was relevant in some discussion forums, which is this complacency regarding climate challenges and the necessary transformation of our models, which is this link, which on the one hand is doubtlessly true between pandemic and climate change, which takes some people to say, well, if we found a vaccine for the pandemic, and let's hope that once the vaccine is widely available in everyone's bodies, the pandemic will be over, I'm sure we'll certainly find a solution for climate change. We'll find a solution that allows us to keep living at the same rate with the same model, and therefore no need for change. So rather than collapse, it's complacency that really worries me. In any case, I believe we had a really fruitful discussion. We've almost run out of, our ability to think after 3 days of intense discussion on European matters.
Who has joined us online, and also Hannah for taking part in this round table. So unless you have anything else to add, I think we're heading towards the end of the session. And if that is not the case, of course, by thanking also very much Cristina for taking part in this round table. Quisiera, por supuesto, agradecer muchísimo.
And of course, I would like to really thank everyone who traveled to CIDOB to be here physically, who allowed this hybrid meeting, with some people being here physically and some people online, after a very long time of purely online meetings, of not seeing each other's faces. And we really appreciate the effort that you all did to come over to CIDOB for 3 days in a row on the 3 sessions where we were able to cover a lot of ground. And then, of course, not to diminish, in any case, those of you who are attending online from, your homes or anywhere where you could log on, that you participated a lot in the discussions. We've tried to gather as many questions as possible. Perhaps some, were left to answer, but I'm sure they were not many, and there were time constraints. And obviously, I wanted to thank, the office for the Commission, the Parliament office, Sergi and Laura, who have been here with us, and as well as Manuel, who were here at the beginning of the session, and which helped us set in motion this first summer course on the challenges of the European Union, on this expert outlook on the institutions. And I think we covered a lot of ground between these two outlooks, from those who execute policies or are behind policies, and those of us who analyze these policies, and that we've had them in every panel. And of course, everyone who has participated on these roundtables yesterday and the day before, from all corners of Europe and here physically in the room. And I would like to remind you all, to those of you who participated in these sessions and who connected online and who were here, next week we'll be emailing you. So those of you who wish to have the certificate of attendance to the summer course, and we'll be also sending a brief survey for, to see your satisfaction and see where we can improve, and would really appreciate you taking the time to complete it for the future. Other matters you'd have liked to see addressed, other perspectives, other methodologies that you would have considered, and of course, expecting that the pandemic situation will allow us to carry out these sessions in a more conventional manner. And I really would like to defend in face-to-face interaction here, because I know there are many of you who couldn't be here today, but who doubtlessly would have liked to be here with us. And finally, I would like to ask all the teams that have been improving this, our broadcasting team. It was quite a challenge to combine this hybrid format with physically. And so the whole team at CIDOB, Hector, Ana, Cristina, we've been behind the scenes in the organization of this course, the Parliament team, the Commission team, and obviously Eloy here. Thank you for the online broadcasting and for having enabled that with the challenges that we have. Remembered, only us who are in this room could listen to the video of the commissary. Remember, you have it available online. So thank you all. Thank you for being here, and see you the next time. Thank you, Christina, Hannah, and Gregor for this last panel. See you soon.